this morning, part of my sermon. So, do you mind just sitting right here until we're ready for our part? Okay. Bethard is the bearer's name. Let's bow our heads for an added word of prayer. Jesus, thank you so much for who you are. Lord, I'm humbled right now because the message for today paints such a powerful picture of you that I am so inadequate to be able to express it. Lord, human language doesn't begin to scratch the surface at what we're going to see in you today. And so, Lord, I just pray that you would rain down your Spirit in a powerful way, that somehow you would translate the weakness of human language into the glory of who you are. And show your face to us today. Reveal yourself. Let us bask in your presence and give you our hearts. Thank you for answering this prayer and for promising to answer prayers like this every single time. Amen. Once upon a time, the beginning of life, family, and faith, we've been walking through this series in the first chapters of the Bible, the book of Genesis. We've been taking it on Thursday evenings at 6:30 and Saturday mornings at 11. And so we've been walking through chapter by chapter. We're going to continue that study this morning, but before we do, just want to give you a little bit of what's coming up. This Thursday at 6:30, Genesis chapter 16, we're going to look at doing God's will our way. I don't know if you've ever been guilty of that. I certainly have. We're going to unpack that from Genesis 16. And then this coming Sabbath, Genesis 17, which I couldn't really come up with the right title for this, so I did something really innocuous. Cut off. Read Genesis 17. We'll just leave it there. But this morning, Genesis 15, when God cuts a deal. I remember being there in college at Southwestern Baptist University, and one evening, my roommate comes into the room looking very flustered, which was unusual because my roommate was normally a very chill kind of guy. He was calm and collected. In fact, he was a little bit mysterious. There were a lot of things that people just didn't really know about him, myself included. But some of the things he would say really gave us reason to believe that he might have some sort of wealth somewhere mysteriously. Sometimes he would stay up all night doing Forex, which is foreign exchange, and so trading foreign currency on his computer and stuff, and then kind of hint at it that he made like hundreds of dollars in one night sometimes. But I'm guessing that he sometimes lost hundreds of dollars in that risky venture as well. But anyway, then my roommate comes in looking kind of flustered, and so I said, "Hey man, how's it going? Are you doing okay? What's up? What's going on?" And he was pretty stressed, and he said, "Well, I got this speeding ticket a few weeks ago, and the payment is like due, like I have to send it in today or tomorrow, whatever it is, or else I'm going to be in huge trouble. And I got the money, I just don't have the cash. You know what I mean? I've got it in my accounts here, there, everywhere, but I need to move some money around, but I just don't have the cash, so I don't know what I'm going to do." And so being a kind roommate, I said, "Well, how much is it?" He said, "It's $80. I said, $80. I was like, "Well, I'll lend you the money. You can give me the money next week. Would that work?" And he said, "Oh, that would be so wonderful. Thank you so much." Now, for some of you, you may be thinking $80, that's like nothing, right? But for a broke college student, $80. Think how many trips to Taco Bell you can take with $80, right? We're talking a lot of money here. But I figured, he could take it back, so we made a deal. We cut a deal. I would give him $80. He would pay me back $80 the next week. Everything would be good. Well, the next week came. I said, hey man, so how about that $80? I said, oh yeah, I need to get that for you. Here, I'll work on it. I'll get it to you soon. Okay, no problem. Another week goes by. Hey man, so remember I lent you $80? You gonna, do you have the money yet? I said, oh yeah, I'll get that to you, no problem. Yeah, I'll get it to you. I'll have it to you like tomorrow. The next week, hey man, so about that $80. And I started realizing that for some reason we began seeing each other less and less. I'm not sure if that was just coincidental or not. So we see each other less and less, and then finally we weren't really that far from the end of school. And I didn't want to just like destroy the relationship by being like nagging all the time. So finally I brought it up less often, casually, but I kept this every time I brought it up. Hey, so remember that $80 that I lent you? Oh yeah, I'll get it to you. Never happened. Well, the end of school comes and we go our separate ways. But we stay in touch. Once in a while we might see each other or text each other or something like that. So finally I was like, man, is he ever going to pay me back? Well, the next school year he ends up going off to Pacific Union College in California, and I'm in Texas at Southwestern Adventist University, so he's planning on going somewhere else. I was like texting him, said, hey man, remember that $80 you owe me? When are you going to get it to me? He's like, oh, I'll mail you a check. Never happened. We had made a deal, and he didn't keep his promise. Finally, on the personal note, I got to the point where I realized what's more valuable to me, $80 or a relationship, a friendship. And I realized, guess what? I just need to let it go. So a while later, I texted him saying, hey man, don't worry about it. You're good. We're covered. I don't need it. Don't worry. But he made me a promise, and he didn't keep his promise. Although my roommate said he would do it, it came to the point that I concluded what he said would have very little impact on my life. If I wanted the $80 that he promised, it was going to be up to me to find it someplace else. I wonder if we have ever felt that way about God. I wonder if we hear his promises, but then go on living as if God is not going to keep them, as if it won't have any effect on our lives, and as if it's all up to us to acquire or obtain or power through whatever we feel like we need to do. I wonder if we ever consciously or subconsciously doubt God's faithfulness. Well, Abram could certainly resonate with us. When God called Abram out of the land of Ur and told him to go to Canaan, God made two epic promises to him. Two epic promises. Number one, God promised that he would have offspring, singular, that he would make him a great nation, that he have offspring, but really the seed pointing to the Messiah. God promised that Abram would have a family that would lead to the promised Messiah. Second promise that God made Abram is that God would give him the land of Canaan. When we think about it, really, the sin of Adam, God uses the call of Abram to restore what the sin of Adam had lost. Are you with me? See, we've been walking through Genesis. We saw that the first 11 chapters, just the author of Genesis just zooms through roughly 2,000 years and then slows down right when we get to Genesis 12, the story of Abram, and the rest of the book takes only about 200 years. So evidently Moses is trying to rapidly get to this main point that Abram is the guy. He's the guy that the whole point is that everything that was lost with Adam, God would restore through Abram. And we're going to see how that happens today. So when Adam and Eve sinned, when they distrusted God, when they chose to not trust in God's faithfulness, but give their allegiance elsewhere, aka the devil, when they did that, they disconnected that relationship with God. But also, as a result, they lost what? They had to leave where? Where did they have to leave? The Garden of Eden, right? And so they lost the connection with God, and they lost the land, the promised land that God had given them. So now God is making a promise to Abram saying, I'm going to give back the two things that have been lost by humanity. I'm going to give back the connection with God, Messiah. And I'm going to give back the land, the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, the ultimate. I'm going to give it back to you and your descendants. So these are two epic promises of God that I would venture to say that even us as Christians sojourning throughout the world cling to these two major promises more than anything. The promise of the Messiah, of a connection with God. The promise of the land, the promised land that's coming soon, that Jesus is going to set up here in the new earth after the millennium, after he comes again. So God gives Abram these two epic promises in Genesis chapter 12, but now we find ourselves in Genesis 15, and nothing has happened yet. Well, actually, maybe a few negative things, but nothing positive. See, God had promised these things, but why hadn't they happened? With the passing of time, it appeared less and less likely that God would be faithful to his promises. Number one, God promised offspring. He promised the Messiah. And Sarah and Abram were still what? Barren. Why hadn't Sarah had a child yet? Every month, Sarah didn't become pregnant was just another discouraging letdown that God had not yet delivered on what he said he would do. A monthly reminder. They were growing older, and if God didn't do something soon, it might get to be a little too late, if you know what I mean. And what about the land? God had called Abram to leave his country, to leave his people, to leave his father's household. Abram gave up the security to come to this land that God had promised, but still, at this moment, none of it belongs to him. Not a single square inch belongs to him. He was a stranger in the land. He knew that now and then in Genesis chapter 14, our chapter previous to this, Abram had delivered his nephew Lot, who had gotten kind of captured or kidnapped by some of the local city-state kings there of the Canaanites. And so Abram had gone and rescued Lot, but as a result, he knew that no longer would his sojourn in Canaan be one of total peace, because he just pretty much laid the smackdown on an alliance of 4 kings, and he knew that they would be back for revenge. God had promised this land, but why hadn't he given it to Abram yet? Would God let Abram and his family die in the land of Canaan before it ever became theirs? Why was God taking so long to be faithful to his promises? Have you ever found yourself asking that question? Have you ever found yourself asking, why is God taking so long to be faithful? Why is God taking so long to answer my prayers? Why am I not seeing him break through in the way I believe he should? With the passing of time, it appears less and less likely that God will be faithful to his promises. And in the meantime, I manage to mess up and struggle. Can we trust God to be faithful to his promises even when it doesn't look like it? Well, Abram has the guts to actually ask God that question. I invite you to open up your Bibles with me to Genesis chapter 15, where Abram himself asks God if he can trust him to be faithful to his promises. Remember, we just saw that God has made these epic promises to Abram, but not yet delivered on anything. Years have gone by. Circumstances have gotten worse. And what is God doing? We're going to find out. Genesis chapter 15, let's start out in verse 1. Genesis 15, verse 1. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Remember, after this is right after Abram's laid the smack down on these other kings, that he knows that they'll be back for revenge, and God says, don't worry about that. Don't be afraid. I am your reward. You know, sometimes we forget when we're in the midst of the struggles, we're wanting to see the rewards from God, when really God says that He Himself is the reward. Our connection with Him is all we need. So God says, I am your very great reward. Verse 2, but Abram said, O sovereign Lord Yahweh, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my state is Eliezer of Damascus. What can you give me? This is a major problem, right? God promised offspring, and yet every month He has not delivered. This is a major problem. Offspring were everything in ancient times. The offspring would preserve the name of the parents. They were the legacy. This is how people believed that their name would not die out, because they had children who would carry on that reputation, that character, that name that they had passed on. And so not only did Abram want that just from a purely familial angle, but yet God had promised something so much more significant for his offspring, that they would be the lineage of the Messiah. And so he says, what can you give me? I don't have any offspring yet. Eliezer is going to be my heir. He's following the typical custom of the day, that kind of the prime minister of his household would just inherit all this stuff because he didn't have anybody else to give it to. Why would God call Abram out of Ur to Canaan just so he could die out? Why wasn't God answering Abram's prayers for a child? Is God going to be faithful? And then Abram kind of ups it a little bit more. And he says, not only what can you give me, but then verse 3, Abram said, you have given me no child, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Who's Abram blaming? Mercy. Have we ever done that? Things don't look good. What are you doing? Well, we're going to find out. Verse 4. Then the word of the Lord came to him. God answers, this man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. Okay, did you catch this interchange? Abram says, how can you give me anything? And God says, oh yeah, I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to give you more as well. That's it. He just says, yes, I'm still going to give it to you, but I'm going to give it way more than what you even think. See, God doesn't give Abram the evidence that Abram is asking for. See, sometimes we think that when we're struggling to trust if God's going to be faithful, sometimes we think we need evidence. Like, God, you got to show us. You got to give me a sign. Does God do that? Of course He does. But what we really need is not evidence in order to trust God. What we really need is revelation. Revelation, that's what God says, right? God doesn't give Abram any reason to believe, any more reason to believe that he's going to deliver on his promises, other than saying, yes, I'm going to, again. And it's going to be even bigger than you think. Check out those stars. You know, you're praying for one. I'm going to give you like a zillion offspring. You won't even be able to count them. And Abram's like, okay, God, you said it. It's you. I believe you. See, when it says Abram believed the Lord, it doesn't just mean in the Hebrew construct that Abram believed the story. Abram believed in God, the person. And he said, so if you're God, then I think I can trust you. What we need to trust God is not evidence, but revelation. We need more. We need to hear more of what God says. We need to see more of His character. In other words, we don't need more from God, we need more of God. Are you with me? We don't need more from God, the blessings and temporal things and all around us. We need more of Him. A relationship, a picture of who He is, of His character. All we need to trust God in what He has already given us in His Word. That's why we care about this book. That's why we open it every day and say, God, speak to me and show me who you are. That's why we come together and learn. That's why we join groups and Bible studies. That's why it matters, because this is all we need in order to trust God and have a life-changing faith. So Abram believes the Lord, and it's credited to him as righteousness. So that was promise number one. Promise number one, the Messiah, right? The offspring, the child piece of it. Now we're going to see promise number two. Okay? Let's continue on in our chapter. Genesis 15, verse 7. So God also said to him, I am the Lord, or Yahweh, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land and take possession of it. So now God's transitioning, said, I'm going to give you the Messiah, I'm going to give you this offspring, and Abram believes him. And then now God's saying, and also I'm going to deliver on that second promise, I'm going to give you the land. And then Abram says, O sovereign Lord, how can I know I will take possession of it? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a young pigeon. What? Did you catch that? Let's unpack that a little bit. So Abram wants to know, how am I going to get this land that has been lost? Adam and Eve lost it there through sin, and then Noah lost it. With Babel, we saw them losing their disconnection with one another, and so now, how am I going to get that land back? And God asked Abram to do something very weird to us in the 21st century, but very normal in the time of Abram. We're going to unpack that, but let's go and keep reading, and then we'll explain it. So he says, bring me these animals. Okay, bring me these animals. Verse 10. We together? Genesis 15:10? Are we together? Yes. Okay. All right. Abram brought these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep. A thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. They will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. We're going to come back to this cutting in half part in just a minute. But God is now saying, hey, your descendants are going to have this land that I'm promising. And so God is giving more revelation into that promise that He's giving. He says, know for certain your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. Which country was that? Egypt, right? Or be mistreated for about 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. Is that what happened? What event was that this is talking about? The Exodus, right? God is prophesying in advance what He's going to do. Okay. Then you, however, verse 15, you, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. So here's what's going to happen to Abram, but his descendants are going to have full possession of the land that God has promised. In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here. God is specific when it's going to happen. For the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So, catch this. I don't want to spend too long unpacking this, but this is a key verse to understand why God allowed such a bloody takeover of the Israelites in the land of Canaan later on. Remember after the Exodus in the book of Joshua where there's all these battles, and how is God just letting all these people just be massacred so that the Israelites can have the land? That's a big topic we can explore another time, but here's a key piece of it, is that God in the time of Abram is still laboring for the Canaanites. That He's still trying to reach them with His character. That He's still trying to show Himself who He is, and His faithfulness, and His love, and His mercy. And so He says, Abram, you can't possess this land fully yet because I'm still working on the hearts of the Canaanites. These terrible people, they're wicked, they're vile. stay away, keep a healthy distance, but I'm still working to reach them. But there will come a time where I've done everything I can do, and I'll have to honor their decision. Let's keep reading. Verse 17, then something really weird happens again. When the sun had set and the darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a what? Covenant with Abram, and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and Jebusites. So God makes a what with Abram? The title of the sermon is with when God cuts a deal. In fact, that word covenant, barith, in Hebrew actually literally means cutting. When God cuts a deal. And so really what God is calling Abram to do in this chapter is he's calling Abram to do this covenant ritual from the ancient Near East, where they would get animals and they would bring them as a ratification ritual for a covenant. And before we get into that, why does God operate in terms of covenant? Really, we find the whole story of the Bible is a story of God operating within covenant with humanity. In fact, the Old Testament and the New Testament can also be called the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Not theologically, perhaps, that some people get off in that piece of it, but covenant is how God relates to his people. And so why does God do that? Well, there's a powerful book called Ingrained and Ingrained by Skip McCartney that actually gives the idea that I think holds a lot of weight, that says that the reason why God relates to humanity in covenant is because God himself is a covenant. God himself, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit is a covenant, a committed relationship of love in and among himself. If you're wondering, this word covenant isn't necessarily one that we use all the time, but a theological definition is a covenant is an agreement that brings about a relationship of commitment between God and his people. And so God is a covenant in and of himself. He is faithful. He is committed. He is love in and of himself. We've explored that concept. And so God naturally shares his godness. He shares his love with his creation, his humanity, the one that was created in his image, and he shares it in the context of covenant. And so when God creates Adam and Eve, he makes a covenant with them. And he says, hey, I will be faithful to you. I have this love relationship with you. And so what do Adam and Eve do with the covenant? What do Adam and Eve do? They break it, right? This connection that they have with God is totally severed. And then God goes to Noah and he says, hey, I will be faithful to you. And he makes a covenant with Noah. And Noah is faithful in part, but then also the covenant is broken again. And so we find this covenant is being broken over and over and over. And so we find all throughout history, all throughout the Old Testament, all throughout the Bible, this covenant is broken, that God is there saying, I will bless you. I will relate to you. I will be faithful to you. And yet humanity is saying, no, we don't trust you. We can't trust that you're going to be faithful. We doubt that you really care about us and that you really love us. And so we are going to live at least maybe halfway in or none of the way in because we don't know that you can fully be trusted. So God is making a covenant with Abram. And what is it? What is this covenant? What is this covenant between God and humanity? If you want to simplify it down to one word, you ready for it? Love. Love. And if you want to expound on that just a little bit, it would be love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and mind. And number two, love your neighbor as yourself. The same two connections that were lost. The connection with God that was lost with Adam and Eve there in the Garden of Eden through sin. The connection that was lost with other humans. Adam right away starts blaming Eve for the problems. The Tower of Babel, where God comes down and he says, hey, he strategically confuses their languages. They're divided up. The relationship with humanity is fragmented, and so this covenant is broken over and over and over. But to basically define this covenant, it's love. It's love God and love others. And if we want to expound on that a little bit further, we can say that there's 10 of these commandments. The first 4 have to do with loving God. The last 6 have to do with loving your neighbor. And so this covenant, these 10 commandments, were placed in a box. And a special golden box that was holy only because it contained the covenant of God. And was placed in the innermost chamber of the Israelite sanctuary, the Holy of Holies. Because this is how God relates to his people in covenant. A total reminder that God is faithful. So what God does here with Abram is incredibly significant. He calls him to carry out this ancient Near Eastern ritual that is a covenant ratification treaty. You ready to help me? So God says in verse 9 of Genesis 15:9, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Verse 10, "Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other." Now I couldn't find a heifer, or a ram, or a goat, but I couldn't find a teddy bear. So, could I have 2 guys who are pretty strong and unafraid of sharp things to come help me? Okay, good. Come on up right here. All right. Maybe stand. Can everyone see it if you guys are right here? Okay, can you hold his feet and you hold his head? Can everyone see this? Okay, so you're going to have to hold it kind of tight. I'm sorry, Bether, but thank you for representing something very significant here. Okay, you can grab the neck, that's fine. I'm just going to try to, we're going to start this way. Now, don't try this at home, okay? Yeah, don't try it at home. Okay, so Abram comes and he brings these animals, and they're going to serve a very significant purpose that we're going to tell you a little bit more in just a second. So,
oh, the humanity.
Thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. You guys appreciate it. So, let me explain. So now Abram has cut, thank you so much, guys. So now Abram has cut the pieces in 2. These were live animals. This is just a teddy bear. These were live animals, okay? But this is a ancient Near Eastern covenant ritual. And so the animal's right here. And so what does Abram do next? It says that Abram placed the halves opposite each other. So I just have one animal. Abram had 4 different species there. So he places them opposite each other, okay? And so he places them there. And so how this ritual works is a covenant ratification treaty. How this works in ancient Near Eastern times, this is something common that they would do. And they would basically cut animals in half. And they were basically treaties between a lord or a suzerain and a vassal. Now the lord or the suzerain would be the one who's the more powerful party. This is the one who would promise protection, who had the power. And then the vassal is the one who would promise service and following the lord or vassal. Okay? And so they had different variations of this. Sometimes they would both walk through. Sometimes just the vassal would walk through. But basically how it worked is they would place the halves opposite each other. So there's this pathway of animals cut in half, and then let's pick the one. Then, for example, the lord or the stronger party would walk through the pieces, and then the weaker party, the vassal, would walk through the pieces. And by walking through the pieces, they would be saying through this ritual, if I break this covenant, may my fate be the same as this animal. If I break this covenant, may I be cut in 2. Are you with me? So God is making a covenant with Abram, and he says, bring me some animals. We're going to do this covenant ritual. Abram is wondering, how can I know, God, if you're really going to deliver your promise? And God says, let me teach you about who I am. Let me give you not necessarily more evidence, but more revelation. Let me tell you a little bit more about what I'm all about. He says, bring me some animals. Abram brings the animals. He cuts them in half. He puts the pieces there. And then comes something incredibly and powerfully significant. Verse 17. Are we together? Verse 17. What is going to happen in this covenant ritual? What's going to happen? When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, are you sensing some eeriness here? There's some mystery. There's some enigmatic elements here. Some visionary elements, some apocalyptic perhaps elements. When the sun had set and the darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. So you probably realize that smoking fire pots and flaming torches cannot walk on their own. And it's totally clear, even in the brevity of this account, even in the lack of detail, we have everything we need to realize who was holding that smoke, or who did that represent, who was holding that smoking fire pot, and who was holding that flaming torch. It's because we would expect that perhaps just Abram would walk through, or if they were doing the other way, that God would walk through the pieces, and then Abram would walk through the pieces. God being the suzerain or the Lord, and then Abram being the vassal, saying, okay, so you will protect me, and I will serve you. And if I don't keep the covenant, may my fate be as these animals, right? But we don't find that. We don't find that. We find instead a smoking fire pot, God the Father walking through the pieces. And then a flaming torch, we find God the Son walking through the pieces. So God is making a covenant with humanity through Abram, saying that I will be faithful to you. But the faithfulness of the covenant doesn't depend on you. It depends on me. And if this covenant gets broken, I will cut myself in half in order to restore it. And we mentioned how throughout history, Abram's descendants broke the covenant. They 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 were unfaithful over and over and over and over. They didn't have the full love for God, the supremacy of love for God in their hearts. They didn't have love for one another. They broke the covenant all the way up to where it seems like the connection between God and humanity would eternally be separated, where there was no chance for any kind of reconciliation. Humanity failed over and over and over again. They were unfaithful over and over and over again, until finally the craziest twist happens in the story. The most mysterious, the most wonderful, the most unexpected thing happens. It's as if God says they've broken the covenant, they've broken the covenant, they've broken the covenant, and now the only way to get them back, I'm not going to have humanity cut in half, although they deserve it. I will cut myself in two, because I am faithful. I'm faithful on what I promised. I'm faithful, and I will never leave them nor forsake them. And so God the Father and God the Son, somehow we don't even understand how to describe this and explain this. Even our theological language just sounds like blah, 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 blah. God the Son became a human. What? It's as if God said, the only way that this covenant will be kept is if I keep it myself. And so God somehow separates himself, or Jesus lays down his attributes that would prevent him from becoming a human. And now there on the scene of human history, we find a human. Jesus. There in a manger. I can only imagine the devil looking on saying, whoa, what? This is unexpected. Him? In there? Let's get him. And so there, the devil, throughout all the years, is pushing everything at Jesus, trying to get him to break the covenant, to break the covenant, to break the covenant. Because if he can get Jesus to break the covenant, the separation that has happened between God and humanity will forever be in place. And so the devil's throwing everything at Jesus every step of the way, but Jesus is faithful to the covenant. At 2 years old, Jesus is faithful to the covenant. At 4 years old, Jesus is faithful to the covenant. And all throughout time, Jesus is faithful to the covenant. The devil's throwing all kinds of temptations at him, but Jesus is faithful, and he's faithful, and he's faithful. Until finally the climax of this in the Garden of Gethsemane, where the devil is just pushing the weight of everything on him. And Jesus could have just blinked and been delivered. He could have gotten out of there. He could have called angels. But instead he said, I will be faithful because it's who I am. And so Jesus goes to the cross. And all the abuse and all the beard being torn out and the blows from people and the mocking and the scorn and the flogging and the nails in his hands, everything, the devil is just probably so overexcited with himself that he's finally got the upper hand on Jesus, and he's just going all out and just getting excited, and finally Jesus says, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. It is finished. And hangs his head and dies. And I can imagine the devil saying, yes! We got him! We got the Son of God! Only to realize, wait, he never broke the covenant. He never broke the covenant. Every year, every instance, he was loving God and loving the other. And then he realizes that the very blow that he thought would win his battle was the very one that gave him a wound that crushed him once and for all. A fatal, fatal wound. Because Jesus was faithful to the covenant. God said the only way that we're going to be able to get humanity back is if I cut myself in half, and if I keep the covenant, if I am faithful. And so the promises of God are not about what you're able to make for God. See, the gospel's never been about the promises you make to God. It's all about the promises he makes to you. And the way we know that we can trust his promises is by revelation, by seeing who he is. That he is a God that simply does not give up, that's more willing to cut himself in half so that we can be restored. And through that act of dying on the cross, humanity and divinity was once again linked in covenant because of Jesus. And he offers that invitation to you, and he offers that invitation to me. That hand that was held out to Adam, and that was clasped but then locked. That hand that was held out to Noah that was clasped and then let go. That hand that was held out to Abram and largely kept, but ultimately through his descendants let go. That hand that was held out to his people over and over and over again, and always let go, let go, let go, let go, let go, let go. Through a mysterious, amazing, wonderful scenario, Jesus himself comes in, flanks the devil through the back door, and we see a human hand clasping the divine hand. And once again, the covenant is restored. And that same hand that was stretched out to all these people long ago is stretched out to you as well. Saying, I, God, Yahweh, the covenant-keeping God, will be faithful. I am faithful. You can trust me. And somebody say, wow, that's an amazing story. That's incredible. What do I got to do? You get to believe it. You get to believe it. Because God is faithful. Amen. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much for being faithful, for clasping hold of the divine hand in a way that we never could, so that it could be extended to us today. God, we know that you are faithful, that you keep your promises, that you were willing to cut yourself in half just to have us back. And Lord, if you're willing to spare no expense, not even your own Son, how much less will you spare to deliver on your promises today? God, we just thank you for the promises of the Messiah, that we can have that covenant relationship with you. We thank you for the promise of the land, that we can live in anticipation of communion and intimacy and fellowship with you in the ultimate promised land, the earth made new. And so, Lord, thank you for being faithful, for stretching out your hand. And we believe that you are. We believe in you. We believe you keep your promises. We believe you are faithful. We believe you are trustworthy. And we believe that your love will change our lives. Thank you. Amen.